Imerda, put the resident file down and step away from the
So
cabinet.
they pinned the whole thing on me. Of course they did.
Power of authority forms naming you as
They
agent.
needed somebody to take the fall, and they picked the one nurse who actually cared.
Imelda Voss operated without oversight for 9 years as a licensed practical nurse in Brookhaven, Washington. 24 elderly residents depended on her. Not one person checked.
10 residents and $440,000.
I'm the easy target. I've always been the easy target, and everyone above me walks while I...
She would not be allowed to finish the sentence. Within 48 hours, detectives from the Brookhaven County Sheriff's Financial Crimes Unit would seize a folder she kept beside her work bag, containing power of attorney templates pre-filled with her own name, ready to be signed and dated against residents who had not yet been chosen. 10 victims. $440,000. 9 years of trust, weaponized against the dying. And one daughter who refused to believe her mother had signed anything. Before we go any further, I want you to think about something. The people who care for our elderly parents in nursing facilities, the ones at the bedside in the final weeks. What do you actually know about them? Drop a comment and tell me, have you ever looked into the staff member who had the most contact with someone you loved in their last months? Subscribe if you haven't yet. We hold these positions of trust accountable every single week because no one else seems willing to. Imelda Voss was born in Spokane, Washington in 1974, the middle of 3 daughters in a working-class household on the east side of the city. Her father drove a delivery route for a regional bakery. Her mother worked night shifts as a certified nursing assistant at a Catholic hospital on Sherman Avenue, a job she would hold for 26 years until rheumatoid arthritis forced her into early retirement. The house smelled, depending on the hour, of bread dough or of the menthol rub her mother used on her hands when she came home at 6 in the morning. Imelda would later tell co-workers that the first medical procedure she ever performed was massaging her mother's swollen knuckles before school, learning the geography of pain on someone she loved before she had ever seen a textbook. She graduated from East Valley High School in 1992. Her grades were unremarkable. Her counselors described her in yearbook recommendation paragraphs as quiet, dependable, and observant. She was not on the path to nursing school directly. She was on the path her sisters were on, which was the path most of her classmates were on, which was the path of finding a steady job and a steady man and staying inside the same 15 square miles for the rest of her life. She worked the front counter at a pharmacy on East Sprague for 2 years after high school, then took a job as a unit clerk at Sacred Heart Medical Center, filing paper charts and routing phone calls for the medical surgical floor. She was 20 years old and earning $8.40 an hour. She was the youngest person on the unit. She married Carl Voss in 1996, a forklift operator at a beverage distribution warehouse. They had one daughter, Marisol, born in 1998. The marriage lasted 11 years. The divorce, when it came in 2007, was civil in the legal sense and bitter in every other sense. And it left Imelda 33 years old, a single mother of a 9-year-old, working a unit clerk job that paid less than $15 an hour with no benefits she could afford on her own. It was Marisol's pediatrician who suggested nursing school. Imelda had brought her daughter in for a strep test and ended up sitting in the exam room for 40 minutes talking about the differential diagnosis of pediatric throat pain like she already worked there. The pediatrician told her that whatever she was doing as a unit clerk was a waste of what she clearly already understood. She enrolled in the licensed practical nurse program at Spokane Community College in the fall of 2008. Her clinical evaluations, preserved in the academic records that would later be subpoenaed, describe her as, quote, exceptionally calm with confused or distressed elderly patients, unquote, and, quote, demonstrates strong instincts for noticing the small changes that families often miss, unquote. One instructor wrote that Imelda had, quote, the temperament that long-term care needs and rarely gets, unquote. She graduated in 2010, passed her NCLEX PN on the first attempt, and accepted her first nursing position at a memory care facility in Yakima, Washington, where she worked for 5 years before relocating in 2015 to a town called Brookhaven in the western part of the state. Brookhaven is the kind of small Washington town that grew around a state highway and a paper mill and aged faster than its founders expected. Population just under 9,000. The median age is 51. There are 2 grocery stores, 1 regional hospital, 1 funeral home, and 3 long-term care facilities, of which Brookhaven Senior Residence is the largest. She applied to Brookhaven Senior Residence in February of 2015. Her interview was conducted by the director of nursing, a woman named Patricia Lindstrom, who later told investigators that Imelda Voss had been one of the most impressive interviews she had conducted in 18 years of hiring. She started on the floor in March. Her starting wage was $23.90 an hour. Her first annual evaluation, filed in March of 2016, described her as, quote, "the kind of nurse who knows every resident's medications without checking the chart," unquote. Her second evaluation, in 2017, noted that families specifically requested her as the primary nurse for their loved ones. Her third evaluation, in 2018, recommended her for a charge nurse premium and noted that she had voluntarily picked up holiday shifts so that nurses with younger children could be home for Christmas morning. By 2019, she was the most senior LPN on the east wing of the facility, the wing that housed the residents with the most advanced cognitive impairment. By 2020, when the pandemic closed visitation and turned every nurse in every facility in America into the sole bridge between dying patients and locked-out families, Imelda Voss became, for 24 residents and for the relatives of those residents, the only voice they heard from inside the building. That was the year the idea began. To understand what Imelda Voss did, you have to understand what a place like Brookhaven Senior Residence actually is and how the trust inside it is supposed to work. Brookhaven Senior Residence is a 112-bed facility licensed in Washington State as a combined assisted living and skilled nursing community. It is not a hospital. It is not a hospice. It is something in between, a building where people go when they can no longer live alone, and where most of them, statistically, will eventually die. The East Wing, where Imelda worked, housed 24 residents on a single hallway, designed for what the industry calls cognitive support, which is the polite term for advanced dementia. The staffing model is straightforward. 1 licensed nurse, supported by 2 to 4 certified nursing assistants depending on the shift, covers the wing for an 8 or 12-hour rotation. The nurse administers medications, monitors vital signs, coordinates with physicians, communicates with families, and signs every chart entry that documents what happened to each resident during the shift, which means the nurse becomes something that almost no other professional in modern American life becomes. The nurse becomes the witness. For residents whose families lived in other states, or whose adult children visited twice a year, or whose only living relative was a niece in another country, the nurse on the East Wing of Brookhaven Senior Residence was the most consistent, most informed, most trusted human presence in their lives. The nurse knew when the resident had slept badly. The nurse knew when a name had been forgotten. The nurse knew which photographs on the dresser the resident still recognized and which had become unfamiliar faces. The families knew this too. They called the nurse, not the physician, when they wanted to understand how their mother was really doing. They asked the nurse, not the social worker, whether their father seemed comfortable. They relied on the nurse to tell them whether it was time to fly out. The families also relied on the nurse for something else, something that is rarely talked about in marketing brochures for assisted living facilities. They relied on the nurse to be honest about cognition. They relied on the nurse to tell them, when the time came, that their mother could no longer make decisions about money, about medical care, about the disposition of her own life. That window, the window between lucidity and total decline, is the most legally consequential window in elder care, and the person in the best position to identify exactly when it opens and closes is the nurse at the bedside. Imelda Voss had spent 15 years learning to identify that window with precision. By 2021, she had decided to use what she had learned. The first resident was a woman named Eleanor Crowley, 83 years old, widowed for 19 years, 2 adult children, one living in Phoenix, one living in Charlotte. Eleanor had been admitted to Brookhaven Senior Residence in late 2019 with a diagnosis of mild cognitive impairment that had progressed by the spring of 2021 to moderate Alzheimer's disease. Eleanor had assets: a paid-off house on Lewis Street, a brokerage account at a regional firm holding approximately $140,000 in mutual funds, 2 certificates of deposit at a local credit union, and a savings account that had not been touched substantively in 11 years. Her children, both successful in their own careers, had power of attorney drafted years earlier through a Spokane law firm. The eldest daughter was the named agent. On April 14, 2021, Imelda Voss brought Eleanor a new power of attorney document during a routine afternoon medication pass. The document had been prepared on a standard form available online, completed by hand with Eleanor's full legal name, address, and date of birth, and pre-signed by a notary whose seal Imelda had photographed during an unrelated transaction at her own credit union 3 months earlier, and reproduced through a process she had taught herself by watching tutorials on a computer at the public library. The document named Imelda Voss as durable agent for all financial decisions. Eleanor signed it. Eleanor signed it because Imelda told her it was a form the facility needed for her records, and because Imelda was the woman who brought her medication every afternoon at 3:45, and because at that moment, in the medication-influenced lucidity of late afternoon Alzheimer's, signing a piece of paper that a kind nurse placed in front of her was the kind of thing Eleanor did dozens of times a week without distress. Within 6 weeks, Imelda had used that power of attorney to liquidate the brokerage account, redirect the proceeds to a money market account she had opened in her own name at a separate institution, and begin the process of obtaining a reverse mortgage on the house on Lewis Street. Eleanor Crowley died in February of 2022. Total drained from her assets between April 2021 and her death: approximately $78,000, plus an additional $41,000 in reverse mortgage proceeds that would not be fully traced until 2024. Eleanor's daughters, when they began the process of settling the estate, were told by the law firm that handled the original power of attorney that there had been a superseding document filed by their mother. They were grieving. They were exhausted. They did not press it. They assumed that their mother had made some decision in her decline that they had not been informed about, and the brokerage statements, when they eventually received them, showed transactions over the previous year that they had no way of contesting. It worked. It worked so completely and so quietly that Imelda Voss did it again 4 months later. The second resident was a retired schoolteacher named Bernard Halloran, 87, no children, one estranged nephew in Florida. The third was a former bookkeeper named Doris Wexler, 91, one son in Alaska who visited annually. The fourth was a retired insurance broker named Harold Schuyler, 79, vascular dementia, one daughter who lived in Brookhaven and visited every Sunday, but who deferred entirely to the nursing staff on medical and financial matters because she did not understand them. The pattern Imelda established was deliberate and consistent. She selected residents who had assets. She selected residents whose families were geographically distant or emotionally disengaged. She selected residents whose cognitive trajectory placed them in what she came to think of as the signing window, the period of months between the point at which they could no longer effectively interrogate a document and the point at which they could no longer hold a pen. She prepared the documents on her own time, in her own kitchen, on a laptop she kept locked in a desk drawer. She brought them into the facility folded inside her work bag. For residents whose cognitive decline had advanced past the point of meaningful signature, she used a different procedure. She had collected, over years of working at Brookhaven, the full names and credential numbers of several other nurses and certified nursing assistants on her wing, information available on identification badges and on facility documents she handled daily. She used those names as witness signatures on forged POAs for residents who could no longer sign for themselves, fabricating witness arrangements that no actual person had ever performed. She kept a deposit tracking log. It was a green ledger book, the kind sold for under $5 at any office supply store, and she recorded in it the date of each transfer, the institution involved, the amount, the corresponding resident, and a column she labeled, quote, status, unquote, with handwritten entries reading, quote, declining, quote, end stage, quote, expected within 6 months, unquote, and, in 5 cases, by the spring of 2023, quote, complete, unquote. Between April 2021 and December 2023, Imelda Voss extracted approximately $440,000 from the accounts and home equity of 10 Brookhaven residents. During the same period, her own financial situation transformed in ways that should have raised flags. She paid off Carl's outstanding share of the post-divorce equity on their former home, took title in her own name, replaced the roof, installed new windows, and paid cash for a 2022 Subaru Outback at a dealership in Olympia. Her daughter Marisol, who had enrolled in dental hygienist school, suddenly had tuition paid in full and a 1-bedroom apartment near campus that her mother covered without explanation. No one at Brookhaven Senior Residence asked. The certified nursing assistants noticed the new car. They noticed that Imelda had stopped bringing leftovers for lunch and was now eating out 4 days a week. They noticed when she mentioned, casually, that she and her daughter had taken a long weekend to a resort in Lake Chelan. They did not ask. Nurses, in their world, sometimes had spouses with good jobs, or inheritances, or quiet second incomes. It was none of their business. The administration did not ask either. Patricia Lindstrom, the director of nursing, would later tell investigators that she had never seen any indicator that warranted investigation, that Imelda's clinical performance had remained excellent, that her charting was meticulous, and that family complaints about her were non-existent. The families of the residents did not ask, because the families of the residents did not know. They were grieving in advance. They were grieving in real time. They were grieving after the fact. And when the financial statements eventually arrived, they were not looking for theft. They were looking for closure. No one noticed. No one checked. No one asked. And then a daughter from Tacoma sat down at her dead mother's dining room table with a manila folder of estate papers, opened a power of attorney document she had never seen before, and looked at a signature she did not recognize. Her name was Caroline Estes. She was 46 years old, a project manager at a logistics company in Tacoma, and her mother, Margaret Estes, had died at Brookhaven Senior Residence on November 9th, 2023, at the age of 84, after 7 years in residence and 3 years of progressive Alzheimer's disease. Caroline had visited her mother every other weekend for the last 4 years. She had watched her mother forget her granddaughter's name, then her son-in-law's name, then her own husband's name, then, in the last months, her own face in the bathroom mirror. By the spring of 2023, Margaret Estes could no longer sustain a conversation. By the summer of 2023, she could no longer recognize Caroline reliably from one visit to the next. By the fall, she could no longer hold a fork. Caroline had power of attorney for her mother. It had been drafted in 2019, when Margaret was still lucid, by a law firm in Olympia, and it had been the only such document Margaret had ever signed. Caroline kept the original in a safe in her home office. She had used it twice during her mother's residence at Brookhaven, both times to authorize medical interventions during hospitalization. In the week after the funeral, Caroline began the slow work of settling her mother's estate. Margaret had owned a small condominium in Olympia that she had moved out of when she entered Brookhaven, a brokerage account at Edward Jones, 2 CDs, and a checking account. The total estate, Caroline expected, would be somewhere between $350,000 and $400,000. What she found, when the financial statements arrived, was an estate worth approximately $90,000. The brokerage account had been liquidated in 2 transactions in May and August of 2023. The CDs had been cashed in the same window. The checking account had been drained over 15 months in a pattern of transfers to an institution Caroline did not recognize. The condominium had been encumbered by a reverse mortgage executed in July 2023. Caroline called Edward Jones. The representative told her that the transactions had been authorized by the named power of attorney on file. Caroline asked which power of attorney. The representative read her a name. The name was not Caroline's. The name was Imelda Voss. Caroline drove 3 hours from Tacoma to Olympia the following morning and obtained, from Edward Jones, a copy of the power of attorney that had been used to liquidate her mother's accounts. She drove home with the document on her passenger seat. She did not stop. She did not turn on the radio. The document was dated March 12, 2023. On March 12, 2023, according to Caroline's own visit records and according to the facility's nursing notes, which she would later subpoena, Margaret Estes had been unable to identify her own daughter, unable to feed herself, and unable to follow a 2-step verbal instruction. The signature on the document was a recognizable approximation of Margaret's handwriting from healthier years. It was not, in Caroline's certainty, a signature her mother could have produced in the spring of 2023. The notary stamp was from a notary in Brookhaven. Caroline called the notary's office. The notary had no record of the notarization. The notary had not been at Brookhaven Senior Residence on March 12, 2023, and had no professional relationship with anyone there. Caroline Estes called the Washington State Department of Health on December 11, 2023, at 9:17 in the morning. She called the Brookhaven County Sheriff's Office at 9:44. By the end of that week, she had spoken with a financial crimes detective named Owen Mercado and a Department of Health investigator named Renata Salinas. By the end of that month, a formal investigation had opened. Imelda Voss was still working her regular shifts. She had no idea. Detective Mercado and investigator Salinas began with a single question. If Imelda Voss had done this once, had she done it before? The Department of Health pulled Imelda's full personnel file and her caseload history for the previous 5 years. They identified 141 residents for whom Imelda had been primary nurse during that period. Of those, 63 had died while in residence. Of those 63, the Department of Health and the Sheriff's Office began the painstaking process of subpoenaing financial records from every institution that had held accounts in the names of those deceased residents. It took 4 months. When the records came back, the pattern was undeniable. In addition to Margaret Estes, 9 other deceased residents on Imelda's caseload had executed durable powers of attorney in the 18 months preceding their deaths, naming Imelda Voss as agent. In every case, the POA had been used to liquidate or encumber significant assets. In every case, the proceeds had been routed through a network of intermediate transfers to accounts controlled by Imelda Voss. The Department of Health retained a forensic document examiner from Seattle, a woman named Dr. Helene Pomeroy, who had testified in over 400 cases involving questioned documents. Dr. Pomeroy was given the 10 POAs and a corpus of authenticated signature exemplars from each of the 10 residents. Her findings were precise. Of the 10 signatures, 8 were inconsistent with the residents' authenticated handwriting in ways that suggested either deterioration of motor control beyond the documented timeline, or assisted execution under duress, or outright forgery. 2 of the 10 were assessed as outright forgeries with high confidence, executed by a hand other than the residents. The notaries listed on 6 of the 10 documents had no record of the notarization in their own logs. 2 of the notaries had been deceased on the dates listed. One was a notary whose seal had been reported lost in 2019. On April 22, 2024, Detective Mercado obtained a search warrant for Imelda Voss's residence on Cedar Ridge Drive in Brookhaven, a modest 3-bedroom rambler she had owned outright since paying off the mortgage in 2022. The search was conducted at 6:12 in the morning. Imelda was home. She was preparing for a 7 o'clock shift. In her home office, in the bottom drawer of a desk she had refinished herself, detectives recovered a manila folder, unlabeled, sitting on top of a stack of unopened mail. Inside the folder were 11 blank durable power of attorney templates, completed in Imelda's handwriting except for 2 fields. The fields left blank were the principal's name, the date, and the principal's signature. Every other field had been filled in advance. Imelda Voss was named as durable agent on all 11 forms. The grant of authority was comprehensive in all 11 forms, covering banking, brokerage, real estate, retirement accounts, and personal property. The language was identical across all 11 forms. The notary blocks were pre-stamped with seals from 3 different notaries, 2 of whom had no record of issuing the stamp, and 1 of whom had been deceased for over a year. The folder was kept beside her work bag. In the same desk drawer, detectives recovered the green ledger book, 3 years of entries, 10 resident names, dates, amounts, institutions, status columns marked, quote, declining, quote, end stage, unquote, and, quote, complete, unquote. They also recovered a laptop containing 37 additional draft POAs in a folder labeled, quote, work files, unquote, photographs of notary seals stored in a subfolder labeled, quote, references, unquote, and a spreadsheet tracking 43 residents on the East Wing by date of admission, estimated assets, family contact frequency, and a column labeled, quote, window, unquote, in which Imelda had estimated the months remaining during which each resident might still produce a usable signature. The spreadsheet had been last updated 3 days before the search warrant was executed. Text messages recovered from Imelda's phone in conversations with her daughter Marisol, who had no apparent knowledge of the underlying scheme, included exchanges that took on a different meaning in context. Marisol, June 14th, 2023, 10:22 ICPM. Mom, can you cover the rent this month? I'm short. Imelda, June 14th, 2023, 10:24. Mem. Already sent. Don't worry about it. I had a good week. Marisol, September 2nd, 2023, 4:14 p.m. You sure about the car? It's a lot. Imelda, September 2nd, 2023, 4:15 p.m. It's fine. Long-term project just closed. Marisol, November 18th, 2023, 8:06 p.m. You okay? You seem stressed? Imelda, November 18th, 2023, 8:19 p.m. Just a hard week at work. One of mine passed and the family is being difficult. It happens. The resident who had passed was Margaret Estes. The family being difficult was Caroline. We are about to get into how the system actually handles cases like this one. Before we do, if you have made it this far, you already know this channel is different. Subscribe and hit the bell. The next chapter of this story is the part that the families have been waiting for, and you do not want to miss what the prosecutor brought to the arraignment. The arrest was carried out at 6:41 in the morning on April 22nd, 2024, in the kitchen of Imelda Voss's home, while the search of the rest of the residents was still in progress. Detective Mercado and a uniformed deputy from the Brookhaven County Sheriff's Office were in the kitchen with her. Imelda was wearing her work scrubs, navy blue with the Brookhaven Senior Residence logo embroidered on the left chest. She had been pouring coffee into a travel mug when the detectives moved from the home office to the kitchen, carrying the manila folder, the green ledger book, and the laptop in clear evidence bags. The body cam footage runs for 19 minutes. Detective Mercado. Ms. Voss, we recovered some items from your office. I want to ask you about them. Voss. Okay. Mercado. This folder. Can you tell me what these are? Voss. Those are forms, work forms. Mercado. They are durable power of attorney forms, with your name pre-filled as agent. There are 11 of them. Voss. I keep templates for families who need them. Mercado. Ma'am, you are not an attorney. You are not authorized to draft or distribute power of attorney documents to residents or families. And every one of these names you as the agent, not the family. Voss did not answer immediately. She set the travel mug down on the counter. She looked at the folder in the evidence bag, and then at the detective, and then at the floor. Voss. I think I need a lawyer. Mercado. That is your right. I am going to read you your Miranda rights now, and then we are going to transport you to the Brookhaven County Detention Facility. Do you understand? Voss. Yes. She was handcuffed in her own kitchen. She asked if she could call her daughter. She was told she could make the call from the booking facility. She asked if she could change out of her scrubs. She was told she could not. The last thing she said to Detective Mercado before being placed in the back of the patrol vehicle was a sentence that would be referenced in 3 separate motions filed by the prosecution over the following 6 months. Voss. I took care of those people. Their families weren't even there. It was not a denial. It was not a confession. It was, the prosecutor would later argue, the closest she would come to articulating the logic of the operation, the belief that proximity to the dying conferred, by some private moral accounting she had constructed alone, a right of inheritance the law did not recognize. The federal indictment was returned on May 9, 2024, by a grand jury sitting in the Western District of Washington in Tacoma. Imelda Voss was charged with 8 counts of aggravated identity theft under 18 U.S.C. Section 1028A, 12 counts of wire fraud under 18 U.S.C. Section 1343, and 1 count of conspiracy related to the fabricated notarizations. The state charges were filed concurrently in Brookhaven County Superior Court and included 10 counts of vulnerable adult financial exploitation under RCW 7434, 8 counts of forgery under RCW 9A 60.020, and 4 counts of criminal mistreatment in the first degree under RCW 9A 42, reflecting the criminal exploitation of dependent adults under her care. The combined maximum exposure, calculated by the United States Attorney's Office at the time of the indictment and confirmed by the Brookhaven County prosecutor, exceeded 120 years. Voss's defense attorney, a Seattle criminal defense lawyer named Adelaide Mercer, filed an initial motion to suppress the contents of the manila folder on the grounds that the search warrant had been overbroad. The motion was denied by United States District Judge Harlan Whitcomb in a written order that ran to 19 pages and that included the following sentence in its final paragraph. Quote, "The defendant maintained, in a folder kept beside her work bag, the instruments of a sustained criminal enterprise against the most vulnerable residents in her professional care. The Fourth Amendment does not extend its protection to documents prepared for the systematic exploitation of dying patients." Unquote. The case is, as of the filing of this report, pending. Voss has entered preliminary not guilty pleas to all federal and state counts. She has been held without bond following an initial bail hearing at which the federal prosecutor, an assistant United States attorney named Constance Huang, argued that the discovery of the pre-prepared blank POAs demonstrated, in her words, that the defendant had not yet finished her work and represented an active and continuing danger to elderly residents in any community where she might be released. The motion to detain without bond was granted. Caroline Estes, the daughter whose phone call had begun the investigation, has been identified by the United States Attorney's Office as a victim witness and is expected to testify at trial. In a statement provided to the court in support of the detention motion, Caroline wrote the following, and I quote at length because every word of it earned its place. "My mother spent the last 7 years of her life inside a building she did not choose, surrounded by people she did not know, slowly losing the ability to recognize the people she did. I trusted the staff of Brookhaven senior residents to be honest with me about her care. I trusted Imelda Voss specifically because my mother trusted her, because my mother used to brighten when she came into the room, because for the last 2 years of my mother's life, Imelda Voss was the only person in that building whose name my mother still remembered. I will spend the rest of my life knowing that the woman my dying mother smiled at was the woman who was emptying her bank accounts. I will spend the rest of my life knowing that the only reason this woman was caught is because I happened to look at a signature and know it was not my mother's. I want the court to understand what that means. It means that everyone else like her, everyone whose family did not look closely enough, never got justice. I am asking the court not to let her out, not because I want her punished, because I want the other families to know that someone finally checked. The families of the other 9 identified victims have been notified. Civil suits have been filed in 5 of the 10 cases. The Washington State Department of Health has revoked Imelda Voss's nursing license. Brookhaven Senior Residence has been placed under enhanced state oversight and has retained outside counsel to review the case files of every resident who has died in the facility over the previous 5 years. The blank POA folder, the green ledger book, and the laptop are in federal evidence storage in Tacoma, where they will remain until trial. Imelda Voss is currently held at the Federal Detention Center in SeaTac, Washington, awaiting a trial date that has been tentatively set for the spring of next year. She is 50 years old. If convicted on the maximum number of counts at the maximum sentencing exposure, she will not leave federal custody before the end of her natural life. The daughter who refused to accept her mother's signature was the figure on whom this case turned. She was, by Imelda Voss's own private accounting, exactly the kind of family member the operation had been designed to avoid. The folder beside the work bag had been prepared against the assumption that no one would ever look closely. Caroline Estes looked closely, and what she found ended a 9-year career, exposed 3 years of systematic theft, and brought 10 families the answer they had been told, by silence and by the chaos of grief, they would never get. This case was disturbing, but the case on the right-hand side of your screen right now is the kind of betrayal that most people cannot believe is possible until they see the evidence with their own eyes. Click it now.